Take that medal off right now. The command sliced through the Memorial Day ceremony so sharply that even the conversations nearest the stage seemed to stop in mid-sentence. Officer Ethan Wallace stood near the front of the crowd, his voice carrying across the town square as dozens of heads turned toward a woman standing quietly beside the Veterans Memorial. For a moment, nobody moved. The American flags lining the walkway fluttered in the warm South Carolina breeze. A brass band on the courthouse steps fell silent. Children who had been weaving between folding chairs stopped and stared. At the center of it all stood Naomi Carter, 54 years old, dark-skinned, silver strands woven through her hair. A navy blazer rested neatly over her shoulders, and pinned above her heart was a military medal that caught a flash of sunlight whenever she moved. Naomi had arrived before sunrise that morning, like she did every year, long before the speeches, long before the crowds, long before anyone thought to pay attention. She had carried a small bouquet of white lilies through the empty square and placed them beneath a wall engraved with the names of service members who never came home. Some of those names still lived inside her memory. Some still appeared in her dreams. She had stood there quietly, reading each one, remembering voices, remembering laughter, remembering promises. Then the town woke up around her. Families arrived. Veterans gathered. Politicians shook hands. And now, somehow, she had become the center of attention. Ethan took a few steps closer. His polished boots clicked against the stone walkway. "I asked you a question," he said. Naomi slowly lifted her eyes toward him. There was no anger in her face, no fear, no embarrassment, just a calmness that seemed strangely out of place in the middle of so much tension. "I heard you," she replied softly. Ethan pointed toward the medal. "Then take it off." A ripple moved through the crowd. Several people exchanged glances. Others quietly reached for their phones. The medal itself was not flashy. It was old. The ribbon showed signs of age. The metal edges had softened over time. Yet something about it seemed important, personal. Naomi looked down at it briefly. Her fingers brushed against the ribbon for less than a second. The gesture felt almost protective, though not because she feared losing it. It felt more like touching a memory. Ethan folded his arms. "Military decorations are not costumes," he said loudly enough for nearby spectators to hear. "People do not get to wear them unless they earn them." The words hung in the air. Naomi remained silent. Somewhere behind her, a flag rope tapped rhythmically against a pole. The sound seemed louder than it should have been. A few veterans seated nearby began watching more closely. One elderly man narrowed his eyes as he studied Naomi's posture. There was something familiar about the way she stood. Not her face, not her clothes, the way she carried herself. The quiet confidence, the discipline, the stillness. Ethan waited. He expected an argument, an excuse, a dramatic reaction. Instead, Naomi simply met his gaze. "I earned it," she said. Her voice was barely above a conversational tone, yet somehow it carried farther than his shouting. The crowd fell silent again. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Do you have proof of that?" Naomi looked past him for a moment, beyond the crowd, beyond the ceremony, toward the memorial wall where the lilies rested beneath rows of engraved names. The sunlight reflected softly from the stone. A distant church bell echoed across town. Then she looked back at the officer and calmly answered, "The truth does not stop being true just because strangers doubt it." For the first time that morning, uncertainty flickered across Ethan Wallace's face. Officer Ethan Wallace held Naomi Carter's gaze for several long seconds, as if waiting for her confidence to crack. It never did. Around them, the Memorial Day crowd remained suspended between curiosity and discomfort. The ceremony had been planned down to the minute. Speeches, music, wreaths, handshakes. Nobody had expected the morning to become a public confrontation. Yet all eyes now rested on the woman standing quietly beside the memorial wall. The sunlight shifted behind a passing cloud, casting moving shadows across the engraved names and the white lilies at their base. Naomi glanced toward the flowers for a moment. The sight seemed to steady her. She had not come here to defend herself. She had come here to remember people who no longer had the chance to stand beneath these flags. Ethan took a slow breath. He was not a cruel man. Most people in town respected him. He coached youth baseball in the summer. He volunteered during charity drives. He believed deeply in service and sacrifice. Perhaps that was exactly why he felt so certain now. A few years earlier, The department had received several reports involving individuals falsely claiming military honors. Those incidents had stayed with him. He had promised himself he would never ignore something that appeared suspicious. Standing before Naomi, he believed he was doing the right thing. "Identification," he said. Naomi nodded once. Without complaint, she reached into her purse and handed him her driver's license. Her movements were unhurried, calm, deliberate. Ethan examined the card. "Naomi Carter," he read aloud. Several people in the crowd leaned forward slightly. A few phones remained raised. The younger officer standing nearby shifted uncomfortably. Something about Naomi's composure was beginning to make him uneasy. Most people who found themselves at the center of public attention became defensive, angry, nervous. Naomi seemed none of those things. She simply stood there beneath the flags as if she had weathered far more difficult moments than this one. The breeze strengthened slightly. The ribbon attached to her medal moved gently against her blazer. Her eyes followed it for a second. Then, without warning, a memory surfaced. Not of ceremonies, not of recognition. A memory of dawn breaking over dark water many years earlier. The sound of helicopters somewhere in the distance. The smell of salt air. The weight of responsibility resting on young shoulders. The faces of men and women who trusted one another completely. Some of those faces remained vivid even after decades. Others had faded around the edges. Yet the feeling never disappeared. Duty, loyalty, service. The crowd around her vanished for a brief moment as those memories passed through her mind. Then she returned to the present. A child sitting near the front row tugged on his grandfather's sleeve. "Why is everyone looking at her?" he whispered. The elderly veteran sitting beside him studied Naomi carefully. His eyes lingered on her posture. On the way she stood with her shoulders relaxed but straight. On the quiet discipline visible in every movement. He frowned slightly. Something about her felt familiar. Not familiar enough to place, but familiar. Ethan lowered the identification card. "Do you attend this ceremony every year?" he asked. Naomi nodded. "Every year." "Why?" Several people glanced toward her. The answer seemed obvious. Yet somehow the question hung in the air. Naomi looked toward the memorial wall again. Sunlight reflected across the engraved names. Her voice softened. "Because some people cannot." The crowd fell silent. Even Ethan seemed caught off guard. There was no performance in her words. No attempt to impress anyone. Only truth. A truth that felt heavier than the accusation hanging over the square. Somewhere beyond the courthouse, a church bell rang once. Then again. The sound drifted across town and faded into the distance. At almost the same moment, several blocks away, a line of dark vehicles turned onto Main Street. Most people did not notice. The crowd remained focused on Naomi. Focused on the medal. Focused on the growing tension surrounding a woman whose story none of them truly knew. But Naomi noticed. Her eyes briefly shifted toward the far end of the street. The expression on her face did not change. Yet something moved behind her eyes. Recognition, memory, and the quiet certainty that before this day ended, the truth would no longer belong only to her. The dark vehicles rolled steadily closer to the town square, their black exteriors reflecting flashes of sunlight as they moved between rows of storefronts decorated with red, white, and blue banners. Most people remained focused on the confrontation unfolding beside the memorial wall, unaware that anything unusual was approaching. Officer Ethan Wallace still held Naomi Carter's identification card. The certainty that had fueled his actions earlier remained, but it was no longer as solid as before. Every answer Naomi gave seemed to raise more questions instead of resolving them. She was too calm, too composed, too comfortable beneath pressure. It unsettled him in ways he could not explain. The younger officer standing nearby glanced toward the end of Main Street and noticed the vehicles first. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Sir," he said quietly. Ethan barely looked away from Naomi. "What is it?" The younger officer hesitated. "I think we have visitors." Several heads in the crowd turned. A low murmur spread through the spectators as people began noticing the approaching convoy. Local officials standing near the stage exchanged puzzled looks. The mayor straightened his jacket. Members of the ceremony committee whispered among themselves. This arrival was clearly not part of the public schedule. Naomi watched the vehicles for only a moment before returning her attention to the memorial wall. Her expression did not change. Yet deep inside, memories were beginning to stir. She recognized the pattern immediately. government vehicles, military coordination, precise timing. Some habits remained recognizable even after retirement. The breeze strengthened across the square. Dozens of American flags fluttered at once, creating a soft, rhythmic sound that filled the silence between conversations. The elderly veteran who had been studying Naomi finally rose from his folding chair. Slowly, carefully. Years weighed heavily on his knees, but curiosity pulled him forward. He moved a few steps closer and looked at Naomi again. This time his gaze lingered longer. The posture, the eyes, the discipline. Something continued pulling at his memory. "Have we met before?" he asked unexpectedly. Naomi looked toward him. For a second, she searched his face. The lines of age had changed him, but not completely. Then a faint smile appeared. "Norfolk," she said softly. The veteran blinked. "Norfolk, Naval Station Norfolk. Summer of 1997. His eyes widened. Several seconds passed. Then recognition finally arrived. Not complete recognition, but enough to shake him. "Wait a minute." He stared at her more closely. "You cannot possibly be." He stopped himself before finishing the sentence. Naomi offered no help. She simply smiled politely. Around them, the convoy came to a stop near the courthouse steps. Doors opened. Uniformed personnel stepped out with professional efficiency. The atmosphere changed immediately. Conversations faded. Phones lifted higher. Reporters shifted positions for a better view. The mayor began walking toward the arriving guests with visible excitement. Ethan watched the scene unfold, increasingly uncertain about the direction of the morning. Then he looked back at Naomi. The metal resting against her blazer caught another flash of sunlight. For the first time, he found himself wondering whether he had overlooked something important. The elderly veteran never took his eyes off her. His breathing seemed to quicken slightly. Fragments of old memories continued assembling inside his mind. Briefings, uniforms, names spoken decades earlier. Finally, he whispered something almost inaudible. "Commander?" Naomi lowered her eyes toward the lilies at the base of the memorial. She did not answer. She did not need to. The veteran's expression changed completely. At that same moment, one final vehicle door opened near the courthouse. A tall man in a decorated military uniform stepped onto the pavement. Sunlight flashed across rows of ribbons and insignia. The crowd immediately recognized that someone important had arrived. Yet what happened next surprised everyone. Instead of heading toward the mayor or the stage, the officer stopped where he was and looked across the square. Hundreds of people stood before him. Veterans, families, reporters, officials. Yet his eyes settled on only one person, Naomi Carter. And the instant he recognized her, his entire expression changed. The decorated officer standing beside the convoy remained completely still for a moment, as if the noise of the entire town had suddenly disappeared. Around him, local officials hurried forward with welcoming smiles, eager to greet an honored guest. The mayor adjusted his tie and began walking across the pavement. Reporters lifted cameras. Volunteers moved toward the arriving vehicles. Yet none of it seemed to matter. The officer's attention remained fixed on Naomi Carter. The expression on his face was impossible to miss. It was not confusion. It was recognition, deep and immediate, the kind that comes from years of shared history. A low murmur moved through the crowd. People noticed where he was looking. They followed his gaze until dozens of eyes settled once again on the woman standing quietly beside the memorial wall. Officer Ethan Wallace felt a knot forming in his stomach. The certainty he had carried all morning was beginning to slip away. The elderly veteran standing nearby seemed equally stunned. His eyes moved back and forth between Naomi and the arriving officer, as if he were trying to confirm what he already suspected. Naomi lowered her gaze toward the lilies at the base of the monument. The breeze lifted a few strands of silver-streaked hair. She looked calm, but inside she knew exactly who had arrived. Admiral James Holloway. The last time she had seen him in person had been years earlier, long before retirement, long before either of them imagined they would meet again in a small town square on Memorial Day. The Admiral finally began walking forward. His pace was measured, deliberate. Every step seemed to increase the silence surrounding the ceremony. The mayor stopped speaking. Reporters stopped asking questions. Veterans watched closely. Even the band members sitting near the courthouse steps lowered their instruments. Ethan instinctively stepped forward. Part of him still felt responsible for the situation. Part of him hoped there was a reasonable explanation that would restore order to the morning. "Sir," he called respectfully. The Admiral slowed but did not stop. Ethan straightened his posture. "We are currently verifying military credentials involving that medal." His voice sounded smaller than before, less certain. The Admiral turned his head slightly toward him. His expression remained calm, professional, yet there was something in his eyes that immediately commanded attention. "Are you?" he asked quietly. Ethan nodded. "Yes, sir." The Admiral looked toward Naomi again. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. Not amusement. Respect. Genuine respect. Then he continued walking. The crowd parted naturally to let him pass. Veterans rose from their seats. Several people removed their hats. The atmosphere no longer felt like a ceremony. It felt like the moments before a truth finally reveals itself. Naomi remained exactly where she was. She did not move to greet him. She did not seek attention. She simply stood beneath the flags with the same quiet dignity she had carried all morning. The sunlight reflected softly from the medal resting above her heart. The Admiral stopped a few feet away. For several seconds, neither person spoke. The silence felt almost sacred. Years of memories seemed to pass between them without a single word. The elderly veteran suddenly inhaled sharply. Recognition finally arrived in full. His eyes widened. "Commander Carter," he whispered. Several people nearby heard him. The title spread through the crowd like a ripple across still water. "Commander. Not Miss Carter. Not Mrs. Carter. Commander Carter." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. The younger officer beside him stared openly at Naomi. The Admiral finally spoke. His voice carried clearly across the square. "It has been a long time, Commander." Naomi's expression softened for the first time all morning. She gave a small nod. "Yes, Admiral. It has." The crowd fell completely silent. And in that instant, Officer Ethan Wallace realized that the woman he had publicly questioned was not who he thought she was at all. The word commander seemed to linger in the air long after it had been spoken. Across the square, people looked at Naomi Carter differently now, yet she did not appear changed by the attention. She remained standing beside the memorial wall, her gaze occasionally drifting toward the engraved names behind her. To everyone else, the revelation felt enormous. To Naomi, it felt uncomfortable. She had spent years making sure those chapters of her life stayed in the background. The Admiral understood that. He could see it in the slight tightening of her expression every time another curious face turned toward her. Around them, the ceremony had completely lost its original rhythm. The mayor stood quietly off to one side. Reporters lowered their microphones. Veterans watched with growing interest. Officer Ethan Wallace remained frozen where he stood, Naomi's identification card still in his hand. The confidence that had driven him earlier had been replaced by something far heavier. Doubt. The Admiral glanced briefly toward him before returning his attention to Naomi. "You still come every year," he said softly. Naomi nodded. "As long as I can." The Admiral followed her gaze toward the memorial. Rows of names shimmered beneath the afternoon sunlight. Some belonged to people he remembered. Others belonged to people he knew only through stories. Naomi remembered all of them. "Most people would have stopped coming years ago," the Admiral said. Naomi shook her head. "Most people are not responsible for remembering them." Those words settled over the crowd with surprising force. A few veterans lowered their heads. The elderly veteran standing nearby removed his cap. The breeze carried the faint sound of church bells from somewhere across town. For a moment, the entire square seemed connected by a shared silence. Then the Admiral spoke again. "That is what I always respected about you." Naomi looked down. "James." His faint smile returned. "You never liked compliments." "Because they were never the point." The Admiral nodded slowly. He knew exactly what she meant. Years earlier, when younger officers competed for recognition and advancement, Naomi had been different. She focused on people, on responsibility, on making certain everyone returned home with their dignity intact. It was one of the reasons so many respected her. Yet she had never spoken about those years herself. Not once. Officer Wallace listened carefully. Every sentence felt like another piece of a story he should have understood before making assumptions. He looked at the medal again. Earlier it had seemed suspicious. Now it seemed almost insignificant compared to the life behind it. A young reporter finally gathered enough courage to ask a question. "Commander Carter, why have so few people heard about your service?" Naomi remained quiet for several seconds. The sunlight reflected softly across the ribbon, pinned above her heart. Finally she answered, "Because the people who deserve attention most are usually the people no longer here to receive it." Several members of the crowd visibly reacted. A woman near the front row wiped her eyes. An elderly veteran nodded slowly. Even the reporter lowered his microphone. The answer required no follow-up. The Admiral looked toward the gathered crowd. "What many of you do not realize is that Commander Carter spent her career helping others succeed." He paused. Some of the people she mentored went on to lead major commands. Some became national leaders. Many never forgot who taught them what service truly meant. Naomi sighed quietly. "You are making this much bigger than it needs to be." The Admiral's expression softened. "No. I think for years people have made it much smaller than it deserved to be." The square fell silent again. Above them, the flags continued moving in the wind. The lilies rested beneath the memorial wall. And for the first time all afternoon, everyone present sensed that the story was still unfinished. The truth about Naomi Carter had only begun to surface, and whatever came next was about to change the entire meaning of the day. The afternoon light softened as a thin layer of clouds drifted across the South Carolina sky. The sharp tension that had dominated the ceremony began to dissolve, replaced by something quieter, something heavier. The crowd remained gathered around the memorial, but nobody seemed eager to speak. Conversations faded into whispers. Even the reporters who had arrived searching for a story found themselves lowering their cameras. For the first time all day, attention shifted away from questions and toward reflection. Naomi Carter stood beside the wall of names, her fingers lightly touching the stems of the white lilies resting below the engraved stone. The polished surface reflected fragments of sunlight and shadows moving across the square. She read the names again, slowly, carefully, the same way she did every year, the same way she always would. Admiral James Holloway watched her from a short distance away. He recognized that look in her eyes. He had seen it before, years earlier, long before either of them had imagined retirement, long before gray hair and small-town ceremonies. It was the look Naomi carried whenever she remembered people who could no longer speak for themselves. Around them, dozens of veterans sat quietly. Some stared at the memorial. Some stared at Naomi. A few seemed lost in memories of their own. The breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and summer flowers across the square. Somewhere nearby, a flag rope tapped softly against a metal pole. The repetitive sound blended with the rustling of flags overhead. No one seemed eager to interrupt the moment. Officer Ethan Wallace remained standing near the edge of the gathering. He had finally returned Naomi's identification card, but his thoughts refused to settle. Everything felt different now. Earlier that morning, certainty had guided every decision he made. Now uncertainty sat heavily in its place. He looked toward Naomi and wondered how many stories existed behind faces he passed every day without noticing. How many sacrifices remained invisible? How many assumptions had been made too quickly? The younger officer beside him remained silent as well. Neither man seemed interested in speaking. The lesson unfolding before them did not require commentary. It required listening. Naomi slowly lifted one of the lilies and adjusted its position beside the stone. The simple gesture drew the attention of several people nearby. It was not dramatic. It was not intended to be seen. Yet somehow it carried more meaning than all the speeches scheduled for the ceremony. A young boy sitting beside his grandfather noticed it too. "Did she know them?" he whispered. The elderly veteran looked toward the memorial wall before answering. "I think she did." The boy studied Naomi carefully. "All of them." The veteran smiled sadly. "Maybe not all of them, but enough." The answer lingered between them. Naomi never heard the conversation, but she would have understood it. Every name represented a family, a story, a dream interrupted by service. That was why she came. Not because of medals, not because of recognition, certainly not because of attention. She came because remembering mattered. The Admiral stepped closer and looked at the wall beside her. Several names immediately caught his eye. Men and women he remembered from earlier chapters of his life. He drew a slow breath. "I still think about them too," he said quietly. Naomi nodded. "Good." The single word carried years of meaning. The Admiral smiled faintly. "You never change." Naomi finally allowed herself a small smile in return. Neither do memories. The wind moved across the square again. Dozens of flags fluttered at once. Their movement created a sound almost like distant voices speaking together. The crowd listened without realizing it. The sunlight broke through the clouds once more, washing the memorial wall in gold. For a brief moment, the entire town square seemed suspended between past and present, between loss and gratitude, between misunderstanding and truth. And as Naomi looked at the names engraved in stone, everyone watching sensed that the most important part of her story had never been the medal on her blazer. It was the quiet promise she had kept for years to never let those names be forgotten. The square remained wrapped in silence. The flags continued to move gently overhead, but no one seemed to notice anymore. Every eye was fixed on Naomi Carter and Admiral James Holloway. The moment felt suspended between heartbeats, between questions and answers, between assumptions and truth. Naomi stood beside the memorial wall, her hand resting lightly near the white lilies. The sunlight reflected across the metal pinned above her heart. For years she had worn it quietly, never mentioning it, never explaining it, never expecting anyone to care. Admiral Holloway looked at her for several long seconds. Then he turned toward the crowd. His expression remained calm, but there was something unmistakable in his eyes. Respect. Deep respect. The kind that cannot be ordered. The kind that must be earned. Most people here know my rank, he said. His voice carried clearly across the square. What they do not know is that many years ago, before I held any command, before I earned any recognition, there was a leader who taught me what service actually meant. The crowd listened, without moving. Even the reporters remained silent. The Admiral looked toward Naomi again. That leader was Commander Naomi Carter. A murmur swept through the gathering. Naomi lowered her eyes. She looked uncomfortable with the attention. The Admiral smiled faintly. That reaction tells you everything you need to know about her. A few veterans nodded. They understood exactly what he meant. Real leadership rarely announces itself. Real leadership often spends more time lifting others than seeking credit. The Admiral took a slow breath. Memories seemed to pass across his face. There were moments early in my career when I believed success was about being noticed. Commander Carter taught me something different. She taught me that leadership is measured by the people you help, the promises you keep, and the sacrifices you make when nobody is watching. The words settled heavily over the crowd. Officer Ethan Wallace stood motionless. Every sentence felt like another reminder of how little he had known. He looked toward Naomi and saw something he had completely missed before. Not authority, not status, character. The kind that remains invisible until circumstances reveal it. The Admiral stepped forward. The sunlight caught the rows of decorations on his uniform. Veterans sitting throughout the square instinctively straightened in their seats. Some already sensed what was about to happen. Naomi seemed to sense it too. "James," she said quietly. The Admiral shook his head. "No, Commander." His voice softened. "Not today." Then, in full view of everyone gathered around the memorial, Admiral James Holloway raised his hand to the brim of his cap. The movement was slow, deliberate, respectful. A salute. The square froze. No one spoke. No one moved. For a few seconds, the only sound was the wind moving through dozens of American flags. Naomi stared at him, clearly surprised. Then something remarkable happened. The elderly veteran who had recognized her first rose to his feet and returned the salute. Another veteran stood. Then another. Then another. Within moments, veterans across the square were standing together, offering the same gesture of respect. Some leaned on canes. Some moved slowly. Some carried the weight of many years. Yet every salute carried the same message. Gratitude, recognition, honor. Tears appeared in the eyes of several spectators. A young boy who had been asking questions all afternoon looked toward his grandfather and whispered, "Who is she?" The old veteran never looked away from Naomi. "The kind of person people spend a lifetime trying to become," he answered. The sunlight broke fully through the clouds, washing the memorial wall in gold. The engraved names shimmered behind Naomi. For a moment it felt as if the people she had spent years remembering were somehow present in the silence. The crowd no longer saw a woman wearing a medal. They saw a life of service, a life of humility, a life built on keeping promises. And as dozens of veterans continued standing in quiet respect, Officer Ethan Wallace realized that the most powerful person in the square had been standing beside the memorial wall all along. The final salute slowly came to an end, but the feeling it created remained suspended over the town square. Veterans lowered their hands. Family stood quietly. Even the children seemed to understand they had witnessed something important. Naomi Carter looked around at the faces surrounding her and wished the attention would pass. Recognition had never been the reason she came here. She had come to honor others. Yet somehow the day had become a lesson about honor itself. Admiral James Holloway stepped beside her once more. His expression carried the calm satisfaction of someone who had finally corrected an old oversight. For years he had watched people underestimate Naomi. For years he had listened as others celebrated accomplishments that had been made possible by lessons she taught long before anyone knew her name. Today, at least for a moment, the truth had been allowed into the light. A gentle breeze swept across the square. The flags overhead moved together, creating a soft rhythmic sound. Naomi glanced toward the memorial wall and smiled faintly. The engraved names remained exactly where they had always been. Unchanged. Permanent. The sight grounded her. Nearby, Officer Ethan Wallace stood alone with his thoughts. Every assumption he had made earlier now felt painfully visible. He replayed the moment. He pointed at the medal. The certainty in his voice. The confidence in his judgment. The crowd that had watched him challenge someone whose story he never bothered to understand. Regret settled heavily inside him. The younger officer standing nearby finally placed a hand on his shoulder. "You should talk to her," he said quietly. Ethan nodded. He knew he should. The question was whether he deserved the chance. Several moments passed before he finally walked forward. Conversations faded as people noticed him approaching. Naomi turned toward him. Her expression remained calm. There was no anger waiting for him. No bitterness. Somehow that made the moment even harder. Ethan stopped a few feet away. For a second, he looked down at the pavement. Then he forced himself to meet her eyes. "Commander Carter," he said. His voice sounded different now. Smaller. More honest. "I owe you an apology." The square became silent once again. No one interrupted. No one looked away. Ethan drew a slow breath. "I believed I was protecting something important, but I let assumptions guide me before facts did." He paused. "And I treated you unfairly because of it." Naomi listened without speaking. Ethan continued. "I never asked who you were. I never asked why you were here. I saw a medal and decided I already knew the answer." The words seemed to cost him something, which made them meaningful. He looked toward the memorial wall before returning his attention to Naomi. "I was wrong." The admission hung in the air. Honest. Unpolished. Real. Naomi studied him for several seconds. The crowd waited. Some expected a speech. Others expected a rebuke. Instead, Naomi smiled gently. "We all make mistakes." Ethan blinked. He had expected many things. Compassion was not one of them. Naomi glanced toward the names engraved in stone. "The important question is whether we learn from them." The tension in Ethan's shoulders eased. Around them, several veterans nodded quietly. The lesson felt larger than either person standing there. It belonged to everyone listening. The Admiral watched the exchange with a faint smile. This was exactly who Naomi had always been. Strength without arrogance. Dignity without pride. Grace without weakness. Ethan extended his hand. Naomi accepted it without hesitation. The handshake lasted only a moment, yet it seemed to close a distance that had existed all afternoon. The crowd slowly relaxed. Conversations returned. The ceremony began finding its rhythm again. And as sunlight reflected softly from the medal above Naomi's heart, everyone present understood that the most powerful victory of the day had not come from being proven right. It had come from choosing kindness when bitterness would have been easier. The ceremony gradually returned to its schedule, but nothing about the afternoon felt ordinary anymore. The speeches continued. The band played softly beneath the courthouse steps. Families gathered together beneath rows of American flags. Yet an unmistakable sense of reflection lingered across the square. People spoke more quietly. They listened more carefully. They looked at one another a little differently than they had that morning. Naomi Carter remained near the memorial wall long after most of the attention had moved elsewhere. That was where she felt most comfortable. Not in the center of a crowd. Not beneath recognition. Beside the names. Beside the memories. The white lilies rested against the polished stone exactly where she had placed them before sunrise. She adjusted one flower gently and allowed her fingers to linger on the cool surface of the memorial. The engraved names reflected the golden afternoon light. Some belonged to friends she still remembered with perfect clarity. Some belonged to people whose voices had faded with time, but whose sacrifices never had. Around her, the sounds of the ceremony drifted in and out like distant waves. Admiral James Holloway approached one final time and stood quietly beside her. Neither felt the need to speak immediately. Years of friendship and respect often required no words at all. They simply looked at the memorial together. After several moments, the Admiral smiled. "They would be proud of you." Naomi shook her head softly. "I hope they would be proud of all of us." The Admiral nodded. He understood. That answer was exactly what he expected from her. Nearby, Officer Ethan Wallace stood at the edge of the crowd watching the scene unfold. Earlier that day, he had seen a medal. Now he saw a life. A life built on service, humility, and promises kept without expectation of reward. The lesson stayed with him. He suspected it always would. The younger officer beside him followed Naomi with his eyes as she stood beside the memorial. "She never tried to prove anything," he said quietly. Ethan looked toward the flags moving in the wind. She did not have to. The sun slowly began sinking lower in the sky. Long shadows stretched across the pavement. Families started gathering their chairs. Veterans shook hands and exchanged quiet goodbyes. Children chased one another across the grass. The town square gradually returned to being a town square again. Ordinary, familiar, peaceful. Naomi picked up the empty paper wrapping from the lilies and prepared to leave. Before she turned away, she took one final look at the memorial wall. The names remained unchanged. The same names she had come to honor. The same names she would return to honor next year. A gentle breeze moved through the square, causing dozens of flags to flutter at once. Their movement created a soft, whispering sound that seemed to fill the evening air. Naomi smiled faintly. Then she began walking toward the parking lot. No cameras followed her. No reporters called after her. No crowd gathered around her. That was exactly how she preferred it. Behind her, Admiral Holloway stood quietly beside the memorial. Ethan Wallace removed his cap and lowered his head for a brief moment of reflection. Veterans continued their conversations beneath the fading sunlight. And above them all, the flags moved peacefully against a sky painted gold and blue. Naomi never looked back. She did not need to. The truth had spoken for itself. The apology had been given. The lesson had been learned. As her figure disappeared beyond the edge of the square, the final rays of sunlight reflected softly from the metal pinned above her heart. Then even that glimmer faded into the evening. What remained was not the medal, not the ceremony, not the attention. What remained was something quieter and far more lasting. The dignity of a woman who never stopped honoring others, and the silent justice that comes when character is finally recognized for what it has always been.